A warm welcome to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sophie Lambin, and I'm the editorial partner for the Women's Forum for the Economy and Society. At the Women's Forum, we believe that women's voices and vision are crucial to building a more inclusive economy and society. In collaboration with the New York Times, we are delighted to be hosting a series of conversations with women leaders. These conversations also reflect our desire to take aim at injustice and inequality, something that is critically needed as events in the US and worldwide clearly demonstrate. Our speakers are women from around the world, women on the front line, women leading us through the crisis and through the recovery. Today, we'll have a very dynamic conversation with a speaker who will talk about governance, women's leadership, and the future of democratic institutions. You can follow our conversation on social media with the hashtag #WomenForInclusion and in her words. And now, I'm very pleased to welcome Alisha Haridasani Gupta, gender reporter for the New York Times, who will lead the conversation today. Alisha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophie. Then thank you everyone for being here. Welcome. America and much of the world is at an intersection of two compounding and related crises, the coronavirus pandemic and the epic economic fallout. Both of these looming issues have had disproportionate consequences for women and minority groups, which is why we are now also witnessing a reckoning with systemic racism and social inequity. Here to help us navigate these issues today is Secretary Madeleine Albright, who, let's face it, really doesn't need an introduction, but nevertheless, Secretary Albright was once among the world's most vulnerable people as a refugee fleeing Nazi rule, then communist rule. But she rose up to become one of America's most powerful people as the first ever female Secretary of State for President Bill Clinton, and during her tenure, shaped much of the post-Cold War world order. The wheels of history, so to speak, came full circle. She hasn't slowed down since leaving office. She teaches at Georgetown University and has been writing several insightful books. She also started a consulting firm that helps businesses around the world work toward a greater good, including, for example, aiding with the efficient distribution of life-saving HIV treatments. In her lifetime, she has been described as, quote, a maternal Winston Churchill, or a, quote, Harry Truman with a PhD. But she has also been credited with teaching the Macarena to the ambassador of Botswana. So without further ado, Secretary Albright, Good afternoon and welcome. Is the story about the Macarena true?
It is, and Alisha, thank you very much for telling everybody who I am, because not everybody always knows. And so not long ago, I was coming back from China, and Chicago was the first port of entry, and I put my stuff down on the conveyor belt and started getting ready for the security people. And the lady behind me said, so where'd you get all those bottles that don't drip? And I said, well, at the Container Store. And then I'm starting to go through the magnetometer, and the TSA guard looks at me and he says, oh my God, it's you. He said, I'm from Bosnia, and we all love you in Bosnia. And if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a Bosnia. And you're always welcome in Bosnia. And can I have my picture taken with you? So we took the picture. The line got all screwed up, and I went back, and the lady of the screw top bottle said, so what exactly happened here? And I said, well, I used to be Secretary of State. And she said, of Bosnia? So thank you for making that clear.
Oh, geez, I cannot believe it. But, well, you know, here we are. You are also known for the pins that you wear, and they all have a meaning. So please explain the pin that you're wearing today.
No. But the Macarena story is true, for sure.
That's good to know.
Let me say, the book that I wrote, the last one, Hell and Other Destinations, I start a little bit about my experience as a child during World War II in London, because my father was with the Czechoslovak government in exile, and we lived in London all through the Blitz. And so my father broadcast over BBC, and I was a little girl, and I thought he was inside the radio. And so BBC, I listened to BBC all the time. And what happened during the war, they began every broadcast with a kettle drum that went da-da-da-dum, which is the first notes of Beethoven's Fifth. And in Morse code, it's V for victory. And so I decided that I would wear the V pin because I learned a lot of lessons out of being with my parents during the war. And then later, when we lived in Yugoslavia and the communists took over Czechoslovakia. And my parents, they had no control over the bombs that were falling. The only thing they had control over was their behavior. And I think that that's something that's very important now, because we average people don't have any control over how the virus started, but we do have control over our behavior. So I thought it was an apt pin to wear right now.
It really is. And for the audience, if you're not aware, I urge you to look up Madeleine Albright's pin collection. There is a whole collection, and it's been in museums. There's a book about it, and they're all selective. She's curated a very selective collection that she wears, and it all started with a feud, I believe. With could you explain where it came from?
I mean, the thing that's interesting, I clearly like jewelry. And when I got to the United Nations, which was in February 1993, it was the end of the Gulf War, and the ceasefire had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions, and I was an instructed ambassador. And my instructions were to make sure that the ceasefire, that the sanctions were carried out and the ceasefire would hold. So I said perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein every day, which he deserved. He'd invaded Kuwait. So all of a sudden, a poem appeared in the papers in Baghdad comparing me to many things, but among them, an unparalleled serpent. So I had a snake pin, and I started wearing it when we talked about Iraq, and the press picked it up. And I was living in New York, and I thought, this is fun. And so I went out and I bought a lot of costume jewelry to depict what we were going to do on any given day. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons. And on bad days, carnivorous animals and spiders. And the other ambassadors kind of picked up the story, and they'd say, what are we doing today? And I said, read my pins. And so that's how it all started. And the reason that I agreed to do the book and to do the tour is that the pins all have foreign policy stories. Yeah. And it's a great way to kind of make foreign policy less foreign. And so what I'm doing now is giving the whole collection. The State Department in the United States has a diplomacy museum now. And so I'm giving the pins to them so that, and it's all got little descriptions about why I wore what pin. Like at one time, the Russians were bugging the State Department, and we found the man sitting outside, and we did what diplomats do, would be démarche Moscow. But the next time I met with the Russian Foreign Minister, Yevgeny Primakov, I wore this huge bug, and he knew exactly what message I was sending.
Yeah. There's no reading between the lines here. Right. It's very clear. So let's get to your book, Hell and Other Destinations. In the book, you said that you still read the paper today and imagine what you would do if you were Secretary of State. So looking at the world around us today, which is imploding in our faces, what is your sort of step-by-step plan of how you would respond?
First of all, one of the things that I write about is that it's very hard to watch one's successor. It's a no-win situation in many ways. Either the guy or woman is better than you are, and they say you're much better, or screws everything up. So it's a very hard thing. And I started always putting my name into articles that were writing about Colin Powell. And, so I have thought about how I would behave. I would behave totally differently than what is going on now, because what is essential is that there be partnerships in order to deal with what we know is an international problem. The virus knows no borders, and cooperation is absolutely essential. And cooperation is essential for dealing with climate change and disease generally, and certain rules about how information is transmitted, and what the social media. So we need to have cooperation. And I have to say that I'm very troubled by the lack of reaching out to other countries now. And if I were in office, I would be making a point to try to regain the trust that is necessary to act together, to try to figure out how to have better bilateral relations, but then also how to use a variety of either regional or international organizations. So I think I've said now many times that at age 75, people and institutions need to be refurbished. And the UN is 75 years old, and it does need some work on it. But there also is how the European Union is used, or ASEAN, or the African Union, any number of regional organizations, or the G20. And so it's a combination of restoring trust in bilateral relations and these larger multilateral relationships, because you don't have to be a genius to figure out you need to work with others on this. So it would be a rebuilding of trust.
Right. And that cooperation also extends, I assume, with the business world. A question from one of our viewers by Antoine Cyr, I hope I'm saying the name correctly, head of the company engagement at BNP Paribas. He says, what role does the private sector have in an inclusive recovery? And I know that you worked with, for example, Merck to help with the distribution of HIV treatments and osteoporosis. So explain sort of what the business world can do to help.
Well, let me say something that I learned when I was Secretary of State, and it always makes people nervous to think you're learning something once you have the job. But I had been asked to come out to the West Coast to deal with the techies by John Chambers from Cisco. And they said, well, the government doesn't have anything to help us. And I said, excuse me, you need the government in order to, get market access and figure out how to operate with regulations in a foreign country. And then the opposite happened. I went to China and would speak to the American Chamber, and there'd be huge audiences. And I would answer questions, but I didn't learn anything. And so I decided that I wanted to meet with representatives of corporations, Americans one at that time, in order to see how they saw things in the country. And it was a little bit different from what the diplomats saw. So I decided that I would establish a prize at the State Department to corporations that were good local citizens. And it made me really understand the relationship between the private sector and the government sector and public-private partnerships. And I really do believe in that, and that the private sector has a very large job to do. And you specifically asked, when we started our business, we're trying to kind of figure out what direction we would go in. And certainly pharmaceuticals didn't have a great reputation, but what you needed to do is people need medicine and they need to figure out what to do. And what happened was Merck put in $50 million. The Gates Foundation put in $50 million to deal with HIV/AIDS in Botswana. And what they needed was to have somebody that could deal with the Botswana government in order to pull all these things together, which is what we did, and spent quite a lot of time with them, but also generally understanding the role of the private sector in dealing with a variety of issues. And I believe in that in so many ways. And I have tried to do whatever I can on public-private partnerships. And one of the things, by the way, when President Obama was in office, he made that speech in Cairo about having different relationships with Muslim majority countries. And Secretary Clinton wanted to enlarge on it by developing commercial relations with Muslim majority countries. And she asked me to run this thing, Partners for a New Beginning, was trying to figure out how to get public and private sector working together. And I'm a great believer in that. And the other part, when we were talking about international organizations, I have believed for a long time that the private sector needs to be at the table earlier, not to just kind of be told what to do, but to be part of a process that tries to figure out some solutions.
Right. So as we're scrambling for a vaccine and a cure for coronavirus, the government and the private sector should be working together now rather than later down the line.
No question. I mean, the government isn't going to develop the vaccine. And I think so many different parts, plus, frankly, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the disruption that the vaccine the lack of a vaccine or the virus has created in countries in terms of what is happening to their economic development and their democracies. And so the private sector is just absolutely a key partner in all of this.
Right. I'm going to read a section from your book, Fascism. You say, fascism draws energy from men and women who are upset about a lost war, a lost job, a memory of humiliation, or a sense that their country is in steep decline. Before the pandemic, the world was already witnessing growing nationalism and a backlash against global institutions. What do you think will happen coming out of it? And do you think we'll see more governments with a fascist bent?
Well, I'm very worried about that. And let me just say what I did. I was seeing the growth of authoritarian governments when I wrote the fascism book. It's called Fascism, A Warning.
And I was seeing the kinds of things that were happening in Hungary, in the Philippines, Venezuela, really more into what, and fascism is not an ideology, it's a process for gaining power. And what you have is these divisions that come about in Italy, for instance. The Italians felt disrespected. They had fought on the side of the Allies during World War I.
They were not kind of getting a recognition for that. They also were having very serious economic problems and divisions in society. And Mussolini was somebody that was a good speaker, that had a view of what needed to be done. And he did exactly take advantage of the divisions to align himself with one group at the expense of another. And the other group were the scapegoats. They were the ones that were responsible for the problem and exacerbated the divisions. Then Hitler took it to a whole other level. But the part that's interesting, and I won't go through all this, is both Mussolini and Hitler came to power constitutionally. And some of the countries that we're going through this now got elected. Now, Hungary, for instance, is a very interesting example. They felt that they lost a lot of territory that was not given back to them. They had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was taken away from them. And in the early 90s, when I was doing a survey of all of Europe, we asked the question, do you think a piece of your country is in the neighboring country? And one statistic I remember, 80% Hungarians thought that a piece of their country was in a neighboring country. So you have Orban taking advantage of that. And then now also with the virus and refugees, allowing himself to all of a sudden have all kinds of authoritarian powers. The best quote in that book, frankly, comes from Mussolini, who said, if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices. And so there's a lot of feather plucking going on now in a variety of places, which is why fascism, a warning.
Right. And you know, we're kind of going through economic pain. We're going through an unprecedented sort of lockdown scenario in some parts of the world still, and there's so many deaths piling up. Do you think this will sort of add fuel to the fire of authoritarian governments sort of using this as an excuse to strengthen their hold? You mentioned Hungary, but are there any other examples?
Well, I am afraid of this because clearly there has been a lot of discussion about how to deal with the virus. And there are those that are hurt by it more than others. In the United States, there's no question that minority groups are really hurt more by the virus, especially Black people. So there is that where there are divisions. Then there is the whole question about what is the role of a central government in trying to help in the pandemic, of working on health programs and having certain rules. So it can be sometimes that leaders with different ideas decide to use the power that is there for the central government to deal with the issue to actually make things worse and divide people up and say it's their fault. And that they brought the disease into the country, or create a lot of international diplomatic problems, but also create an animosity. And then the thing that does happen is, you know, there are issues about identity. People always want to know their identity, which is great. But if my identity hates your identity, it becomes nationalism, and hyper-nationalism is dangerous. So if you see fascism and the rise of authoritarianism, it comes in initially because there are problems, and then ex-leader really then takes advantage of it to make the divisions worse and say it's the fault of the neighbors, or it's the fault of a group of people that are refugees, or any number of different aspects that leave it open for the worst kind of usage and undermines democracy and moves towards the possibility of authoritarian governments.
Yeah. You mentioned centralized government being, crucial in this response. Some of the countries that have done really well, like South Korea or New Zealand, they all have really functioning centralized governments. But, something like a lockdown or contact tracing outside of the coronavirus context could be seen as quite undemocratic. It sort of is a very fine line there. So how do we restore faith in the democratic institutions that the world has right now?
Well, I think it is going to be hard work, because there does have to be some centralized aspect. People are very nervous because of their privacy, and some people who don't want to be told what to do anyway about things. But I do think that one has to be very careful, and therefore I do think that, to go back to some of the original things you asked, is there needs to be some international way of trying to figure out some rules. What are the rules for the use of information? Where does privacy come in? And this requires having conversations where people trust each other, instead of thinking that they're on the opposite sides. I think we are in one of the most crucial periods that I've ever seen. And I'm old, and I've seen a lot of very serious problems of World War II and communism taking over. But I don't think we're going to go back to something. We need to develop a system which is able to deal with the following fact, is that there's been a breakdown in the social contract, that people gave up a lot of individual rights in the 18th and 19th centuries in order to have a relationship with a government that is supposed to provide services and listen to what they have to say. And what has happened is that social contract, it has been stressed. And I do think we are operating in a very, very different world, and we need to be prepared for the changes that we want to have happen and those that make us very nervous.
Right. In a 2010 interview with Pat Mitchell, you mentioned that women should be at the center of foreign policies because societies are better off when women are empowered. But in just the last 2 years, particularly with the rise of autocratic governments, the UN has warned that the gains women have made are actually being rolled back. And then the pandemic happened, with so many of its burdens falling on women. Do you worry that this crisis would set women back? And how do we course correct here?
Well, I have been very pleased to be able to say the following thing. The countries where there has been some control over the virus are countries that are all run by women. New Zealand, Taiwan, Finland, Germany, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. I think it's very interesting. So I've been asked, how come? Yeah. And I do think that there are characteristics that women have that lend themselves to being good leaders in a crisis like this, and when there isn't one, but certainly in a crisis. And I do think the following thing. I think as women come to power in various countries, or take more part in businesses and a variety of positions, that women get there by being dependable, being collegial, being helpful, not by saying I'm smarter than you are and I deserve this job. So there's that. Then I think, and this is a generalization, I think that women are really good at multitasking, because that's what we have to do in life. And it is something that is important for the lives that we lead. But also, I think it gives us the capability of having peripheral vision, of kind of seeing what is coming down the road. Right. Again, this is a generalization. I think men are actually better at looking at one subject very deeply. Then I do think that women do try to base what they're doing on facts, of trying to figure out what has really happened, so that they can make decisions. And then I also think that women are caregivers,
Yeah.
and as mothers, they certainly don't want to divide up their families and have one group hate the other. So there are a number of I think, capabilities and qualifications that I think women bring to both public service and the private sector. And I do think it is really worth looking at. Now, I'm often asked whether the world would be better off if it was totally run by women. And I say, if you believe that, you've forgotten high school. But
Right.
I do think that it's important for us to work together with men and really try to figure out how to be problem solvers. And so I do think because we do have different capabilities, but I think it's interesting that on the virus crisis that the countries run by women are doing better.
Right. Right. And building on your answer, there's a question from a student at the University of Ottawa, Bibi Hakim. She says, how do we encourage more women and minority women to set up and enter the world of diplomacy? What are your words of advice?
Well, I think that it's a great career, frankly. I think women actually are pretty diplomatic. And one of the things I have to tell you is that's the basis of diplomacy is being able to put yourself into somebody else's shoes and to really see where they're coming from and not have everything be a zero-sum game. I win, you lose. That it's something where we look for cooperation. I also do think, I do teach at Georgetown at the School of Foreign Service, so I spend a lot of my time, all my time, frankly, trying to make foreign policy very interesting. And urging people to go into diplomacy, whether officially in the State Department or in business. I think in many ways that public-private sector aspect is very important, and that the private sector also offers an awful lot of potential and interest and problem solving in order to deal with what is going on internationally. So I think it's a great career, given everything that's going on. Foreign policy and international relations is a growth industry. It really does need people. And
Yeah.
I really, when I was saying everything's going to be different, I do think that the younger generation has a lot of potential in order to work within a system where there needs to be a lot of changes and an understanding of, how structure works, how all the technical aspects that are there, the possibilities of virtual meetings, all the different things that one gets from understanding what the forces are today, technology.
Right. When you were ambassador at the UN, you created a group called the G7 of all the female ambassadors at the UN at the time, and there was a grand total of 7. So, how important is it to see women in leadership for future generations?
I think it's very important. I do think that, and it's very funny, how this all came up. When I was at the UN, there were 183 countries. And it was one of the first times that I didn't have to cook the lunch myself. So I asked my assistant to invite the other women permanent representatives. And I thought there'd be a lot of people at my apartment. And I get there, there's 6 other women. And it was Canada, Kazakhstan, Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, Philippines, and Liechtenstein. And so we decided to call ourselves the G7. And we lobbied together in order to get women judges on the War Crimes Tribunal, because so many of the crimes had been committed against women in the Balkans. And we also did the girl thing and said we would always take each other's telephone calls. So that made the men mad. And they said, why are you taking a phone call from Liechtenstein? And I said, well, have yourself replaced by a woman. I'll be very happy to talk to you whenever you call. But I do think it's important to have more women in a variety of positions, because as I said earlier, we bring different kinds of talents. And I do think that, and then the part that's just practical, in every country, at half or at least half or more than half of the population is female. And so it's a waste of a resource not to get women really involved. And so I am a groupie. I think it's a good idea to get women together to support each other. And by the way, one of the things I do in my teaching, I always do kind of a role play. And when I started teaching in the 80s, I made sure to have women in jobs that they hadn't had in real life. So I had a woman Secretary of Defense, or I make it a point when we talk about the roles that are there for in my I do these game simulations, is to make sure that there are women in roles where men have to report to them, or they have to have a voice in what is being done.
Right. There is one more question. We have time for maybe two more questions. There's one question from Renee Webb. She is a EU representative and a senior advisor for the Bermuda government. And she says, in your role as Secretary of State, what is it that you most regret?
Well, I do regret that we weren't able to work more with American participation in the UN, and also to try to figure out how to do more. When I was there, one of the big things that was going on was how to make the peacekeeping operations work. And it was something brand new. I wish that we had done more at the UN. And obviously, the thing I regret the most is what we didn't do in Rwanda. And so I was trying to figure out, when I was secretary, how to operate within a system that would make my colleagues understand the importance of international organizations, and to figure out how to work with the private sector. But my biggest regret really does come from what happened when I was at the UN. And so I was trying to figure out, once I got into the job of Secretary of State, how to go back and look at what could have been done differently.
Right. I'm going to ask you something a little more fun. If you were able to assemble like an Avengers style superhero dream team right now to come in and fix the world, who would be on that team?
Well, it certainly would be a female team, you know.
Right.
Very, very much so. And I do think, without naming names, I think women that are in office, that know what they're doing. And then I would really try to look at some women that are both in an executive and a legislative branch. I would try to have a female CEO, and then of a company, but also then have somebody that heads up a non-governmental organization, and really have a team, because you don't want everybody that's exactly the same. I'm about to do a program for the National Democratic Institute with Angelina Jolie. And she made the most amazing movie about what was going on in Bosnia. So I would want her on my team.
Right. Yeah, I think everyone would want Angelina Jolie on their team in one way or another. And last question, taking into account all that we have discussed, what needs to happen to build back better?
I think what needs to happen is a recognition, as I said earlier, that things are different, that we are dealing with problems that require international cooperation, that require a knowledge of your own society. I've always really think it's very important for domestic audiences to understand why national security policy is important to them, not to build walls, not to divide up. And so what I would stress is the fact that the international cooperation is important in putting together the pieces that can deal with entirely new problems. And you do need the scientists, and you need to figure out who comes from what sector and really work together more. And I certainly, I'm often asked if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot. But the reason that I'm an optimist is because of young people. And so, as I stressed, I think that there are many aspects of talents that young people have. We've criticized them, for instance, for being online too much or not understanding privacy. And all of a sudden, they're the ones that really understand the technology. And so I think, and then the part that I really would do is make sure we talk to people with whom we disagree. and try to understand where they're coming from and not just tolerate them, but to figure out what is motivating them. And so it is going to require more communication and less hyper-nationalism.
Right. Thank you so much for your time, Secretary Albright. It was such a pleasure to be with you here today. And that's it for our chat today with the Women's Forum for the Economy and Society. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I had a great time. Thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you so much, Secretary Albright. Thank you so much, Alisha, for this such a wide-ranging and inspiring conversation. We had hundreds of people for tens of different countries attending with so many questions that we were not able to take. Secretary Albright, I just wanted to pick up on your opening statement that in times of crisis, we really only have control of our behavior, which is a really strong reminder of the responsibility we all have. I also loved your invitation to collaborate among women, with men, between public and private sector. And if I may, to plagiarize your famous quote, I would say that there is really a special place in our hearts for women like you, who have stood for other women all their life and career. So I would really like to thank you for that on behalf of the Women's Forum and everybody who has attended this session today. So for everyone, if you want to share this great conversation, the recording will be available later today on this website. And we can all look forward to upcoming sessions with Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the IMF, and with Melinda Gates, co-chair of the Gates Foundation, in the next few weeks. So look out for those conversations to come. Let me close this session by thanking you again for the great contribution. Thank you.